You remember the first time we kissed? Leah's voice was barely more than a whisper, yet it carried across the quiet room like a fragile thread, delicate enough to break if touched too hard. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I watched her, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug she held, knuckles white from tension, eyes flickering between me and the window, where the rain left thin, wandering trails across the glass. There was a weight behind the question, one I didn't need her to explain. I knew the kind of night she'd had, the kind that pulled a person inside themselves and left them vulnerable. How could I forget? I said softly, not because I wanted to impress her or to nudge something into existence, but because it was true. I'd remembered every detail, every moment, every hesitation. The memory wasn't romanticized or glossed over. It had been real, awkward, imperfect, like her, like us. She looked at me then, a small, hesitant smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, as if surprised I'd said it, as if she hadn't expected that kind of presence. I felt a warmth spread through me, not the frantic kind of warmth you feel when you're infatuated, but the kind that grows steady and sure, the kind that stays even when nothing is happening. We didn't speak for a while after that. There was no need. The sound of rain against the roof, the hum of the heater, the faint smell of coffee and damp clothes filled the silence. I realized then that she trusted me enough to be fragile in my presence, and that trust was heavier, somehow, than any confession, any kiss, any declaration. I didn't move closer. I simply stayed. The space between us was enough, and yet somehow it wasn't. I didn't know you remembered, she murmured finally, her voice catching slightly, as if the words themselves were a risk. She set her mug down and let her hands rest on her knees, as though bracing herself against the possibility of disappointment. I remember I said, how you laughed when I tripped over that rug, how your hair smelled like rain when we went to the cafe, the way your eyes looked, like you were both afraid and certain of everything all at once. I didn't look at her as I said it. I looked at the window again, letting the rain blur the lines of the world outside. I wanted her to feel the steadiness of my presence, not the urgency of a man chasing a feeling. Her shoulders relaxed a little. She let out a slow breath, one that carried relief, but also hesitation. I could sense the quiet reckoning in her chest, the private negotiation between fear and hope. Do you ever think about it? She asked, the question lighter now, more playful than urgent. A test, perhaps, or maybe a tentative invitation. I nodded, still watching the rain. I do, I said simply, and it's enough for me that you remember it too. She didn't say anything. She just leaned back, tucking her feet beneath her, eyes tracing the shadows the rain made on the floor, and I stayed, quietly, steady, knowing that sometimes, simply being there, letting someone hold a space for themselves, is how everything begins. I've always thought that some things are remembered not because they were monumental, but because they were quietly etched into the edges of ordinary. Leah's question that night pressed me into that thought again. I sat back in my chair, listening to the rain tick softly against the roof, and let my mind drift to the moments that had led us here, the small fragments of time we'd shared, scattered across years like forgotten photographs in a drawer. We had met long before this night, of course, though it never felt like meeting at all. It was more like noticing each other in slow motion, the kind of noticing that doesn't demand immediate recognition, but waits patiently until both parties can understand the significance. I remembered her at the cafe where she spilled coffee on the table and cursed under her breath, and I remembered myself, fumbling for napkins, trying not to laugh too hard at the clumsiness that made her blink in surprise. That day, we had talked about nothing at all, and yet I had felt something then, something imperceptible but steady, like a stone settling into a riverbed, slowly reshaping the current. That night in her apartment, after her family dinner, I realized how much had gone unsaid between us. It wasn't dramatic, and there were no sudden betrayals or misunderstandings. It was simpler, a quiet accumulation of missed chances, deferred conversations, and the subtle hesitancy of two people who didn't yet know the contours of each other's hearts. I could feel it now, the gentle tension in the air, a mix of curiosity and caution that made her fingers twitch nervously against the edge of her mug. I've wondered, she said after a while, her voice low, if we ever, could have been different back then. Her eyes searched mine, hesitant, but full of a vulnerability that caught me in a way words could not. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on my knees, careful not to overwhelm her space. We could have, I said softly, but I don't think it matters. What matters is now, not what was, not what could have been, just what is. The simplicity of the words surprised her. They carried no expectation, no pressure, just a presence that was unwavering. I wanted her to feel that, to know that someone could be beside her without demanding, without forcing. She exhaled, a mixture of relief and something like disbelief. I'm not used to people staying, she murmured. It wasn't a complaint, just a quiet confession. I nodded. I don't run, I said. Not from the past, Not from you, not from what's real. I kept my voice even, steady, offering more than promises. I offered certainty. The silence that followed was comfortable, the kind that grows between two people who understand that nothing needs to be rushed. Leah smiled just a little, and for the first time that night, I noticed how she relaxed in a way that wasn't performative. She trusted me enough to let the weight of the day slip off her shoulders. And in that quiet, between the hum of the heater and the patter of rain, I realized that the real beginning wasn't marked by a kiss or a confession, but by simply being there, fully, without expectation, without demand, without haste. The knock on my door was quiet but insistent, a small punctuation in the otherwise steady rhythm of the. I opened it to find Leah standing there, holding a store-bought pie, her hair damp from the drizzle outside. She looked fragile, like a paper boat caught in a slow current, and I immediately stepped aside to let her in. There was no need for words yet. The air itself seemed to acknowledge the unspoken tension she carried from the family dinner she'd just escaped. She set the pie on my kitchen counter and leaned against it lightly, hands gripping the edge as if it could anchor her in place. I fetched 2 mugs and filled them with hot tea, the steam curling into the space between us. She watched the motion quietly, not demanding attention, only allowing presence. I handed her a mug and settled into the chair opposite her, letting the silence stretch comfortably before the words found their way out. "My parents," she began, voice barely above the hum of the heater. "They just don't get it. Or me. Or maybe they never tried." Her eyes fell to her, twisting the handle of the mug, knuckles pale against the ceramic. I nodded, giving her the space to continue without interruption. "They expect everything," she said, voice cracking just slightly. "Achievement, appearances, and when I don't, I just feel small." She exhaled sharply, as if the weight of those words might lift if released carefully. I didn't speak immediately. I simply watched, letting the room absorb her vulnerability. "You're not small," I said finally, my voice steady, gentle. "You just haven't given yourself permission to be otherwise around them. And that's okay. You don't have to perform for me. You don't have to prove anything." She looked up then, her eyes glistening, a flicker of something fragile and tentative there. Hope, perhaps, or relief. She moved to the sofa, curling her legs beneath her, and I followed suit, settling nearby but not too close. We didn't talk about the past dinner anymore. Instead, we shared small confessions, trivial observations, the kind of quiet intimacy that grows slowly and steadily. The pie sat untouched for a while. The tea cooled. The rain continued to fall. At one point, she leaned her head slightly, not on my shoulder, but toward it. A mere fraction of trust given without demand. I didn't shift. I didn't suggest anything. I simply existed there, as she had quietly chosen to exist in that moment. And I realized, as I watched her exhale and close her eyes briefly, that sometimes proximity alone, without grand gestures or declarations, is what reshapes the edges of a person. Hours passed unnoticed. The night outside softened, and inside, the room carried the warmth of mutual presence. There was no urgency, no drama, only a steady acknowledgement, 2 people sharing space, observing each other's quiet endurance, and, perhaps, beginning to redefine what it meant to feel safe. Leah started showing up more often, at first without any clear reason, and then with reasons that mattered only to her. She would knock on my door with a book in her, or linger by the kitchen counter with a cup of tea, her voice soft, her presence tentative. I never asked her to come, never suggested she stay. I only offered the space, and she accepted it on her own terms. One evening, she arrived just as the sun was dipping behind the skyline, painting the apartment in muted gold. She carried a small bag with a blanket inside, the kind of blanket that had clearly been folded and refolded, a comfort from somewhere else she trusted. "I thought we could read," she said quietly, her eyes glancing toward the sofa, then meeting mine for a fleeting second. There was a hesitancy to her words, as if offering a small invitation, afraid of rejection or misreading, and yet I understood it completely. I nodded, gesturing to the sofa. We settled in, not touching, just sitting close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly when she shifted. The book was old and worn, the pages soft with use. She read aloud for a few minutes, voice trembling slightly on words that were difficult to pronounce, then smiled at me shyly. I didn't need her to notice anything in me. My attention was on her alone, not as a judgment, not as a measure, but simply as presence. We spent hours. Some days, the reading would stop entirely, and she would watch the shadows move across the room, tracing the contours of furniture, and I would pour tea, adjust the blanket around her shoulders, or simply let silence fill the air. No words were necessary to acknowledge that this space, this small, ordinary apartment, was becoming something rare, a sanctuary. "You make it feel easier," she said, one voice barely above the hum of the Her hands were folded around her mug, fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. Like I can exist without trying so hard. I gave a soft smile, understanding that this was not a compliment offered lightly. It was an acknowledgement of trust, and I treated it with care. I'm glad, I said simply. You can exist however you need to. That's all I'm offering. Her lips parted slightly, a quiet exhale escaping, as though relief had found a place to settle. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a brief moment, and I sensed that she believed. Not completely, not yet, but enough to stay. That was all that mattered. Evenings passed without urgency. We shared small, deliberate routines. Tea, blankets, soft conversation, the occasional silence that said more than words ever could. The subtle weight of mutual trust hung between us, and in it, I found something steady, something real, and she, perhaps unknowingly, found a safe space to return to, time and time again. Leah spoke about him one evening, her voice low, hesitant, as if revealing a wound that had never fully healed. The breakup she described had been quiet, almost imperceptible to the outside world, but it had left its mark on her. He didn't leave in anger, she said, or with words. He just disappeared, slowly, in small ways, until there was nothing left to hold on to. She swallowed hard, her fingers clutching the mug as though it could anchor her to the room. I listened, letting the silence stretch, allowing the gravity of confession to settle without interruption. I understand, I said finally, careful not to fill the space with platitudes. It's difficult when someone chooses absence over presence, but that doesn't define you. It doesn't define what you can have now. My voice was steady, deliberate, offering reassurance without demanding anything in return. I wanted her to feel the difference between expectation and choice, between compulsion and voluntary presence. She shifted, tucking her knees beneath her, eyes tracing the patterns of light across the floor. I've been afraid of letting someone in again, she admitted. Because what if I'm wrong? What if I trust someone and they leave too? Her voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, I wondered how many times she had carried that fear alone. You won't know until you decide, I said. Not out of fear, not out of habit, not because someone else failed you. You choose, and if you choose to let someone stay, that choice has weight. It matters. I kept my tone calm, unwavering, the kind that doesn't flinch under uncertainty. She looked at me then, a subtle shift in her posture that signaled recognition. She understood, even if only partly, that she was not obligated to let the past dictate her present. We stayed in the quiet, letting the room breathe around us. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, the kind of sound that encourages reflection rather than distraction. I poured tea again, sliding the mug toward her without words, and she accepted it, nodding faintly. It was a small gesture, yet in it lay the gravity of a silent promise. She could choose to stay, and I would be there, without force, without condition. Later, she rested her head lightly against the edge of the sofa, a movement so small it could have been accidental, yet charged with intent. I didn't comment or move closer. I simply sat nearby, steady, letting my presence be the answer to the fears she hadn't voiced aloud. She exhaled slowly, releasing some measure of tension I hadn't realized she had been carrying so tightly. It was in these understated moments, these fragile exchanges of trust, that our bond began to solidify. No grand gestures, no declarations of urgency, only the patient weaving of two lives into a quiet, shared rhythm. She didn't need to see it yet. She only needed to feel it. The slow pulse of reliability, the subtle proof that choosing to stay could be its own kind of love. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle that evening, leaving the city drenched and quiet, the streets reflecting the muted glow of streetlights. Leah was sprawled on the sofa, a book resting on her chest, eyes closed, the kind of surrender that comes when a person trusts a space enough to let themselves exist without pretense. I moved around the apartment, arranging a few things, making a cup of coffee, and letting the silence fill the room in the spaces between us. There was no urgency, no expectation, only the slow pulse of ordinary life acting as the quiet rhythm of connection. I settled into the armchair near her, keeping my distance yet close enough that the warmth of the room enveloped both of us. She shifted slightly, and I could hear the faint sound of her breathing, the subtle cadence that spoke more honestly than words ever could. I considered the years we had known each other, the fragments of shared time that had been so small, so almost invisible, and yet here we were, existing in a space that neither of us had needed to define in grand gestures. A sudden clap of distant thunder made her stir, her fingers curling slightly around the blanket she had tucked around herself. I didn't move toward her. I only glanced up from the book I had been absent-mindedly thumbing through, letting her see that I was there, steady, present. She exhaled softly, relaxing after a moment, and I realized that it was not proximity that mattered most, but the assurance that someone had chosen to remain. Minutes passed like this. I poured the coffee into 2 mugs, placing one on the table within her reach. She didn't speak, but her fingers found it naturally, curling around the warm ceramic as if drawing strength from its weight. I stayed silent, knowing that silence could be as healing as any conversation. She lifted her head slightly, eyes half-lidded, and whispered, "It feels easier, like I can stop bracing myself for everything." I nodded without replying, understanding that this statement carried more than gratitude. It was acknowledgement of trust, of fragile vulnerability shared and received without judgment. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Occasionally, one of us would murmur a comment about the rain, the light, the book, and then we would drift back into the quiet. The room had become a sanctuary of unspoken support, each gesture small, yet deliberate, each silence significant. Her breathing slowed as the night deepened, and I could see the tension leave her shoulders in subtle waves, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. I leaned back in my chair, eyes on her, letting the warmth and the silence coexist. There was no grand declaration, no sudden realization, only the careful, patient weaving of two people learning to hold space for each other. In that quiet, I understood that what we had was beginning to root itself, not with words, not with urgency, but with steady, enduring presence. Leah's decision to stay in the city that weekend came without announcement, a quiet assertion of agency that caught me slightly off guard. She had been planning to leave with her parents, to follow the rhythm of their expectations, but at the last moment, she chose differently. I didn't comment, didn't question. There was no need. I simply adjusted my own plans, ensuring that the weekend would allow her presence to be felt without pressure or obligation. The park was nearly empty, the early autumn leaves damp from rain, and the air held that faint scent of earth and wet grass. We walked side by side, her pace measured, careful, as if testing the boundaries of comfort and trust. Neither of us spoke much at first, letting the quiet of the surroundings dictate the rhythm. I noticed the subtle relaxation in her shoulders, the way her gaze lingered on details most people, a fallen branch, the way a puddle reflected the overcast sky, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. "You know," she said after a while, her voice light but thoughtful, "I didn't think I don't know, enjoy a weekend alone like this." She paused, glancing at me briefly, and then looked forward. There was a vulnerability in her tone, a tentative acknowledgement that she had chosen differently than she might have in the past, and that choice had weight. "That's the point," I said softly. "The choice is yours. You don't need permission or explanation. You simply decide what feels right for you." I didn't reach for her hand. I let my words carry the presence of certainty instead. She absorbed them quietly, letting the meaning settle into the spaces of her thoughts. Later, as we walked along the path bordered by low hedges, our hands brushed briefly, an almost accidental touch. Neither recoiled, neither pressed closer. It was the kind of contact that could be easily dismissed, and yet it felt deliberate, a subtle acknowledgement that she was beginning to allow trust to grow. When I noticed her glance toward my hand, the faintest curve of a smile appeared, hesitant and quiet, and I understood that she had noticed the unspoken offer. We continued in silence, the sound of our footsteps mingling the occasional call of a bird and the distant hum of the city. It was a slow, deliberate kind of companionship, one built not on urgency or passion, but on the steady accumulation of small, mindful choices. By the time we returned, the sky had shifted into soft twilight. She leaned slightly closer as we walked up the steps to my building, her shoulder grazing mine lightly. No words were exchanged, but the gesture said enough. In this slow unfolding, trust was forming, and the small choices we made were reshaping everything without either of us needing to name it. The power had shifted subtly between us, not with words, but with the quiet accumulation of presence. One evening, the electricity went out, leaving the apartment bathed in the gentle flicker of candle. The shadows danced along the walls, elongating and shortening as the flames swayed. Leah sat cross-legged on the sofa, the blanket she had brought wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the soft glow. I remained in my chair, holding a mug of warm tea, watching her in that quiet, steady way that no words could replicate. The room was filled with an intimacy that was unspoken but profound. She tilted her head slightly, studying the movement of the flames, and I noticed the small inhale she took, a subtle indication that she was letting herself exist without the constant tension she usually carried. There was no rush to speak, no expectation to fill the space with conversation. The silence itself was an offering, a kind of understanding that had taken months to cultivate. After a while, she whispered, almost to herself, "Do you remember the first time we kissed?" The words were fragile, tentative, and I could hear the careful way she balanced hope against fear. I didn't answer immediately. I let her feel that the moment itself was acknowledged. When I did respond, my voice was soft but deliberate. "How could I forget?" I said, letting the weight of the memory rest between us. I saw her exhale slowly, a mix of relief and wonder. The question, though simple, held layers of unspoken longing and hesitation. And the answer was not just a recollection, but a confirmation that presence had meaning beyond the act itself. She shifted slightly, moving closer, though not enough to touch me. It was a delicate negotiation, an understanding that connection need not be forced to exist. I remained still, steady, allowing her the space to define the boundaries, to test the comfort of proximity without compulsion. Her eyes met mine for a brief moment, searching, questioning, and finding a calm that reassured, without demanding. We didn't speak for long after. The shadows on the walls, the subtle flicker of candlelight, the gentle hum of distant rain outside, all of it carried a quiet conversation in its stead. Leah leaned back, her fingers brushing the blanket, and I watched as a rare relaxation settled over her features. That night, in the simple act of sharing silence, we understood something crucial. Intimacy could be slow, deliberate, and patient. It did not require urgency, declarations, or dramatic gestures. It existed in the quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence, in the careful attention to small movements and unspoken trust. And in that understanding, the bond between us deepened, fragile yet unbreakable, formed not by a kiss alone, but by the patient persistence of simply being there. Leah had started to linger longer, as though the walls around her had softened just enough to allow her to step inside fully. One evening, she paused at the threshold of my apartment, holding a small set of keys in her hand. She didn't speak immediately, just looked at me, uncertain but deliberate, as if weighing whether to place trust in something tangible. I didn't rush her, didn't reach out. I only observed, letting her decide what she was willing to share, what she was ready to claim as her own. "Here," she said finally, voice quiet, almost hesitant. I thought it might be easier if." Her words trailed off, leaving a space that needed no completion. I understood instantly. She was offering a piece of herself, cautiously, testing the boundaries between independence and shared space. I nodded gently, taking the keys without comment, holding them in my hand for a moment as if acknowledging the gravity of her gesture without dramatizing it. "You don't have to," I said softly. "This is yours if you want it, or not. No pressure." I wanted her to understand that the choice itself was sacred, that her agency mattered more than the token she offered. She exhaled, a faint mixture of relief and disbelief, as though the simple act of being allowed to choose had shifted something inside her. Days passed, and the keys found a place on the entry hook, their presence a quiet affirmation of trust. She brought a change of clothes one evening, leaving them neatly folded, small gestures of permanence without demand. I noticed how she moved through the apartment, slowly allowing herself to inhabit the space as if the walls themselves had welcomed her. We continued our routines, tea, reading, conversation, and silences. But now there was an added layer, a quiet acknowledgement of commitment without words, an understanding that what we were building didn't need to be named to exist. The subtle weight of choice, of mutual recognition, was more binding than any declaration. One night, she lingered in the kitchen while I prepared tea. Her fingers brushed against mine as she took the cup, a fleeting touch that spoke volumes, unspoken promises embedded in the warmth of the gesture. I met her eyes, holding the gaze long enough to convey presence, protection, and calm, and she smiled softly, a delicate acknowledgement of trust returned. In the quiet that followed, I realized that the significance of the small routines, of the gentle touches and deliberate silences, was not in the acts themselves, but in the choice to stay, the decision to belong. And in that understanding, I saw her beginning to, finally believing, in small increments, that she could be here, fully, safely, deliberately, and that I would be there, not as a demand, not as a solution, but as presence. The morning light came soft and pale through the window, casting long, quiet shadows across the apartment. Leah sat on the sofa, a cup of coffee cradled in her hand, the steam rising in delicate spirals. I watched her from the chair across the room, reading a book I hadn't opened. The silence between us was familiar, a companion rather than an absence, and it carried a weight far deeper than words could. She glanced up briefly, eyes meeting mine, and for the first time, I noticed the subtle shift in her posture, a relaxation that was not performative, not cautious, but genuine. The shoulders that had once carried the tension of expectation were softened, the jaw once set tight now relaxed, as though the room itself had absorbed her defenses. I didn't speak, didn't reach out. I only let the moment exist, knowing that presence alone could communicate more than any attempt at verbal reassurance. "You've been steady," she said quietly, voice almost a whisper. "Even when I wasn't." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like fragile glass. I didn't answer, not immediately. I simply met her gaze, letting the steady calm I felt convey what words could not. She exhaled softly, a subtle acknowledgement that she had begun to trust, to allow herself to feel anchored. We sat together like that for hours, sometimes reading, sometimes just drinking coffee and listening to the city awaken outside. Occasionally, our hands brushed, a light and deliberate acknowledgement of closeness, but never forced. The room carried the quiet rhythm of two people learning the art of staying without expectation, of offering presence without compulsion. Later, she leaned back, resting her head on my shoulder just enough to feel the warmth without demanding it. I adjusted slightly, letting the contact exist naturally, as though the gesture itself had always belonged here. No words were needed. The moment carried all the meaning necessary. Her exhale was slow, deliberate, and I could feel the subtle release of tension that had long lingered, a quiet testament to the trust we had built over weeks of small, deliberate acts. By the afternoon, the apartment was filled with soft light, and Leah moved freely, inhabiting the space as though it had always been hers to explore. I observed her, not possessively, but with a quiet sense of certainty, knowing that her presence here was a choice, deliberate and unpressured. As the day stretched on, I understood that the most beautiful moments often arise not from declarations or drama, but from simple decisions: to remain, to witness, to offer steady companion. Leah's choice to stay, to exist fully and safely within this shared space, was the culmination of everything we had quietly cultivated. And in that simple, unspoken understanding, the bond between us had found its most profound expression, the quiet, deliberate, enduring promise of presence.